All right, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and being part of our seminars. My name is Cinnamon Moffett, and I'm going to be your host for today. If you are new to this venue, this is a hybrid event, so we have folks online and folks in the room. For folks online, your cameras, mics, and screen shares have been disabled, but if you would like to interact with us based on technical questions, or if you have questions for today's speaker, go ahead and put them into the chat box in Zoom. And our volunteer, Roseanne, hi Roseanne, will go ahead and either help you with those technical questions or read out the questions for today's speaker. For everybody in the room, once we get to question and answer, if you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll bring you a mic. That way folks online can participate in our question and answer as well. But again, thank you so much for being here. I wanted to make a couple of quick announcements. One of the things that's coming up pretty quick is next week on March 12th, we have our next Science on Tap when Tuba Oxken-Haller is going to be here to talk about changing science with sneaker waves. So that's going to be kind of a cool one. I don't know if you've noticed, but I know in my apps, I'm starting to see sneaker wave notifications. That didn't happen a couple years ago. So she's going to come and talk about that a little bit. And so that'll be pretty great. I also just wanted to promote Marine Science Day, which will be a month later. So on April 12th, for researchers in the room, if you haven't requested a table, please do so. I'll send out a reminder tomorrow. So if you're not sure that link, I'll send that out. For the public that's in the room or folks that don't want a table, just come and join us. This is our open house. This year, it's really important to celebrate science. Come celebrate with us. This will be a good day for it. The other thing I wanted to say is for next week, we do these seminars every single week. And so next week on March 13th, Jinwei Song's seminar had been canceled due to some complications with weather. And so he's going to be back on March 13th to talk about the single cell journey of Hydictonia. And so he works with Coombs and ARS and the Shellfish Breeding Center. So come and support one of our own March 13th. So come on back. But I wanted to just jump in with what we've got going on today. Look at all these papers I got going on. Introduce today's speaker. We have Jordan Kruse here, who earned a PhD in biomathematics from Rutgers and a PhD and master's in fisheries at Oregon State University. He worked for 16 years with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and most of that time as the head of a marine fisheries research program. He then undertook a 17-year career with the University of Alaska Fairbanks and retired as a professor emeritus in 2018 and is now making his home in Corvallis. During his career, Gordon has conducted a wide variety of applied marine fisheries research, including stock assessments, population dynamics, ocean fisheries, marine ecosystem dynamics, and fisheries management. He worked closely with the state and federal fisheries management agency throughout his career, including serving for 24 years as a member, including some time as a chair of the Scientific and Statistical Committee of the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. During his career, he conducted research on diversity of marine fish, invertebrate species with emphasis on crabs, and he remains active in several scientific advisory capacities, including the nonprofit Bering Sea Fisheries Research Foundation. And I'm just really excited to have him here and to talk a little bit about the fisheries, crab fisheries in Alaska. So I'm going to hand this off to Gordon. Welcome.
Thank you, Cinnamon, for that very nice introduction. Great. Can you hear me okay? Thumbs up. Perfect. Great. Well, thank you all for coming out. It's really great to see you. And today I'll be talking a bit about ecosystem-based fisheries management pertaining to the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands crab fisheries. And I want to begin with a shout out to my collaborators. This was very much a team effort. So federal collaborators, Aaron Fedowa and Cody Zawalski, and with the state of Alaska, Ben Daly, and then finally Diana Stram with the North Pacific Fishery Management Council. So I'm clicking a button I thought would advance. I'm clicking here. Okay. So this down arrow?
Yep.
Okay,
Oh, side arrow.
side arrow, okay.
Yep.
And let's get that, whoops.
Yep,
the
you got it.
marker.
Yep, click that right there. One on the top.
Got it.
There you go.
Okay. Thank you again. This is actually a talk that I first gave back in October 2023. It was a keynote, one of the keynote addresses at the International Conference on Lobsters and Crab Management in Fremantle, Australia. So it's nice to be able to present it again, and particularly as in January, a corresponding paper was published. And at the end, I'll show a link to that if anyone cares to download it. So a little outline of what I'll be covering today. Just the first primer into what is ecosystem-based fishery management, and then I'll give a brief introduction to Alaskan crab fisheries. Then I will be summarizing legislation, governance policies, and plans that provide for EBFM in Bering Sea, Alaska, Aleutian Islands crabs. And I'll summarize exactly what we're doing in practice, and then identify some future directions, and particularly under the situation of climate change. So let's start with EBFM, which is basically an interdisciplinary approach, and it tries to balance many things that are ecological, social, and governance principles. And the idea here is to have a sustainable resource. And it has various facets that include using the best available science and effective monitoring, consideration of the appropriate temporal and spatial scales over which we're doing the management, acknowledging ecosystem dynamics and uncertainties about those dynamics, and it's heavily stakeholder involved. And just for clarification, ecosystem-based fishery management is ecosystem-based management applied to the fishery sector. Okay, why EBFM? Well, there's some general consensus that classical single species fishery management approaches are limited and have not always worked as intended because they haven't considered the species in the broader ecosystem. And so there's a recognition of the need to go beyond single species management and consider the impacts of fishing on non-target species, ecological interactions, and fishing gear effects on habitat, that there's other ecosystem services that components of the ecosystem provide beyond a catch, a harvest, and that there's trade-offs between ecosystem components. You can't have everything high at the same time. And many processes operate at the ecosystem level. And then finally, that humans are an integral part of marine ecosystems. So a little bit about geography. Some of you may not know all these place names. These are the 4 fishery management regions in Alaska. They correspond to large marine ecosystems, with the exception that the Arctic, Chukchi and Beaufort Seas are separated. So there's actually 5 large marine ecosystems here out of the 66 around the world. So it's a big area. I will mainly be talking about the Eastern Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, but realize there's also crab fisheries in the Gulf of Alaska. And at present, all commercial fishing is banned in the Arctic with an eye toward the sensitivity of many endangered and other species there that could be compromised by fishing. Some specific place names, starting in the Aleutian Islands. Here is Adak Island, where we have a red king crab fishery. On the Eastern Bering Sea shelf in southeastern Bristol Bay, there's southeastern Bering Sea, there's Bristol Bay. Moving further out, there's Pribilof Islands, including St. George and St. Paul. Then we have St. Matthew Island, and our farthest north commercial fishery for crab occurs in Norton Sound. So here are the main species. There are others, but these are the main ones. So for king crab, there's red king, blue king, and golden king crab. And stocks and fisheries associated with them for red king crab in Bristol Bay, Pribilof Islands in Norton Sound, and Adak. Blue king crab around the Pribilof Islands and St. Matthew Island, and golden king crab in a vast extent of the Aleutian Islands as well as Pribilof Islands. And then moving over to tanner crab and snow crab, they're broadly distributed on the Eastern Bering Sea shelf, with snow crab tending more toward the north and southern tanner crab, or just tanner crab, more to the south. And I want to point out there's other crab stocks in the Bering Sea and in the Gulf of Alaska that are managed solely by the state of Alaska, but I'll be focusing on those that are cooperatively managed. Here's a summary of commercial harvests of crab since the 1950s. I think it would be clear that it's been very volatile. This kind of greenish color signifies the beginning of crab fishing in Alaska with the Bristol Bay red king crab. And with oscillations and collapse, Tana crab fishery began, and that's in this pink color. You can see it's been very sporadic. And then finally, the biggie in this purplish pink color is snow crab, and again, with wide cycles in abundance, culminating in a couple of closed years due to very low abundance recently, which I'll also be speaking about. So how do we do EBFM and what legislation and governance is associated with it? Unlike Canada, which has an Oceans Act, which basically in one-stop shopping place gives the impetus for EBFM, in the US, it's more of a hodgepodge of acts that collectively allow for EBFM to occur. Leading among these is the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act. And among other things, it has 10 national standards that command us to prevent overfishing, use best science, minimize bycatch, and other principles that you would expect in an EBFM approach. Second on the list is the National Environmental Policy Act. And it's been argued that this really enables EBFM for our fisheries in the US and the EEZ. It commands, for example, whether an environmental assessment or a full environmental impact statement would be required as association with a major change in fishery management. And then there's an executive order looking at cost-benefit analyses, a Regulatory Flexibility Act that looks at impacts on small entities, which would be on, say, the individual fishing boats, as an example. And then there's other laws that have to be adhered to associated with marine mammal protection and endangered species. In the Bering Sea Aleutian Islands region, it's truly a cooperative fishery management program between the federal side and the state side. And there is a federal fishery management plan that articulates specifically what the state and federal roles are. So there's many day-to-day fishery management activities that are totally the purview of the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. There's another category of actions that are specified in the FMP, but they're framework. So the state can pretty much do what they want as long as they follow the guidelines and are within the parameters specified in the plan. And then finally, there's a more restricted set of actions that are only taken on the federal side, such as an IFQ program or some big ticket items like that. So on federal side, it's the North Pacific Fishery Management Council that recommends the changes in regulations. They are assisted by an advisory panel of stakeholders and a science and statistical committee, which I was formerly a member that Cinnamon mentioned. They meet jointly 5 times a year in general. There's also a crab plan team, which is largely scientists, but also fishery managers and economists that kind of do a lot of the background level work and doing stock assessments and such to bring through the system, through the SSC and the advisory panel into the council, play a critical role. And then there's National Marine Fisheries Service, which is charged with implementing the regulations passed by the council in federal waters. On the state side, there's an Alaska Board of Fisheries, which is the equivalent of the North Pacific Fishery Management Council. They meet 4 to 5 times per year, but they usually only take up Bering Sea crab issues every 3 years. They can take some out of cycle if there's an emergency or some priority. And interestingly, the Board of Fisheries has 85 local advisory committees scattered across the state, including one in the Pacific Northwest, to give a voice to people in their communities that's then forwarded through the process. And then Alaska Department of Fish and Game is the agency responsible for implementing the management actions advised by the Board of Fisheries. So let's get into it now. One of the biggest programs associated with BSAI crab fishery management is what's called the Crab Rationalization Program. And this was passed in 2005, implemented in 2006, and there's some plan amendments associated with it. And this is kind of a supersized, souped up IFQ program. So as you might expect, there's harvesting quota shares that are assigned to individual harvesters based on their harvest history. But it goes beyond that and it assigns processing quota shares. So processors can be guaranteed they get a certain percentage of the crab delivered to them to process, again, based on their processing history. And then finally, even more unique is a community development quota share program that allocates 10% of the annual total allowable catch to 65 rural Western Alaska communities. And the goal here is to get them involved in fishing activity and economic development. And many of these Western Alaska communities are rather impoverished, so that provides some all-important employment. So here's a chart showing the labels along the coastal margin are the 65 communities, and they're parts of 6 community development quota programs highlighted in the different colors. And this has been a real social economic program that's been very successful for this region. So what about policies and plans? The council adopted an ecosystem policy, which has all the things that you'd expect, the vision statement and implementation strategy. It's intended to affect everything they do and be considered in everything they do, that every action has at least considered ecosystem approaches. They've also developed 2 fishery ecosystem plans, one for the Aleutian Islands region, and more recently one for the Bering Sea. And these are not actionable plans, like they do not specify, fishing quotas or gear or that sort of thing. It's largely informational, describing these different ecosystems, what are key ecosystem indicators that might indicate change in the system, and other activities. There's also a Bering Sea fishery ecosystem plan that provides strategic guidance for monitoring ecosystem status, action modules that I'll describe in a moment, and outreach and communication. Here's an idea where these fishery ecosystem plans fit in. So on the left is the basically core fishery ecosystem plan, and there's currently a couple action modules that when completed could actually result in changes in the core fishery ecosystem plan. And then coming out of that could be strategic items that would go through ecosystem reports and assessments on through plan teams and to the council to actually make changes based on the ecosystem, but it has to come across and go through the standard process. So I mentioned action modules in the Bering Sea Fishery Ecosystem Plan. One of those is LKTK, local knowledge, traditional knowledge. And the goal here is to develop protocols for using local and traditional knowledge in management, as well as to better understand the impacts of council decisions on subsistence. And in this Western Alaska region, subsistence is absolutely huge. And there are communities that really still don't have cash-based economies. It's really based on their harvest of resources and exchange with each other. So this is an important consideration. So the local knowledge is based on a person's experiences, whereas traditional knowledge is kind of a living body of knowledge that passes along, and it's part of the traditions and heritage of indigenous communities. The second action module recently has been on climate change, and the goal here is to try to evaluate vulnerability of key species and fisheries to climate change, and to the extent possible, build resilience in fisheries management. It has a task force, and they compiled a report called the Climate Change Readiness Synthesis to assist in assessing the climate readiness of the council. We've had a lot of changes. I'll talk about some toward the end of the talk. So how can we best set up ourselves to deal with these changes in the future? This little cartoon-like diagram highlights how some of these things are intended to interact. So if we look here, there's a climate smart decision tools. This would include designs of assessment surveys that are already geared up to deal with shifting distributions. A lot of species are shifting north with climate change. And then the next part of the process is ecosystem foresight, which is basically looking at tipping points and early warning signs. Hey, this change in the system might cause this in the future, in the near-term future, maybe even this year. And then a rapid response. How about EBFM in practice? I've mainly talked about plans and processes in place to deal with it, but let's look at what actually has been done in recent decades. And we need to begin with the state and federal catch specification process. First among these is setting the overfishing level. That's for most other jurisdictions, it's maximum sustainable yield, but in our region, it's the limit. It's the point above which you would not allow fishing and could compromise the ability of a stock to produce MSY on an ongoing basis. Then below the overfishing level is acceptable biological catch. There's a buffer there, and the buffer is to provide safeguard so that you're not shooting for ABC and you overshoot and you go to OFL. We don't want to overfish by mistake, but more importantly, there are a host of factors that I'll mention in a moment that are simply uncertain, and we could be wrong about the MSY calculation. So there's a buffer there to address that. The acceptable biological catch is both the OFL and the ABCs are set by the Scientific and Statistical Committee. So the council themselves hear about it, but it's the SSC, so this SSC sets it, so it's purely science-based. So that's the federal role, and then the state of Alaska takes over and sets the actual total allowable catch for each crab fishery in the BSAI region under the plan. And there's an additional buffer there. I also want to point out that while we're trying to manage fishing mortality, the attempt here is to consider all sources of fishing mortality, not just how many crabs come to the dock, but how many are discarded because they're female and illegal or sublegal, and how many of those might die, as well as the number that are caught as bycatch either in other crab fisheries or in groundfish fisheries, injured and tossed over. So it's an attempt to here account for all fishing mortality to the extent possible. So dealing with the buffers between the overfishing level and the acceptable biological catch, a new process has been developed called the risk table. The risk table deals with uncertainties that are not already included in the assessment. And they might be assessment related. They might deal with population dynamics, environmental and ecosystem considerations, and fishery performance. And then they are graded along the left side here as being normal, like this is a typical range of uncertainty that you might expect, so no additional buffer for uncertainty is required, all the way down to level 4, which is extreme concern, which might be appropriate when we have a marine heat wave and we see mass die-offs of seabirds and other things happen that might then also translate to the fish stocks and the crab stocks. A couple of examples how factors have affected crab stock assessments. One was in 2020, we had a couple years of marine heat wave, and that elevated temperature was used to justify a 5% increase in the buffer between overfishing level and ABC. Another example is that there's an annual summer trawl survey that tries to estimate abundances of groundfish and crab. And in years that are cold, which are becoming rarer, but years when it's particularly cold, the molting of the mature females is delayed, such that the survey might come through before that molting process occurred. And that might cause them to resurvey this area because the harvest strategy is based on, at least largely in part, the mature female abundance. That could all change with a molt. An immature crab can become mature. So just a couple of examples. I'll now move to how bycatch is addressed in the crab fishery management plan. Specifically bycatch and area closures, and beginning with red king crab, there's this red region here called Zone 1, which has a limit on the number of crabs that can be caught and killed by a groundfish trawl fishery. And it's stair-stepped depending on crab biomass. And when that prohibited species catch cap is hit, that trawl fishery closes for the rest of the season or the rest of the year. That orange square is the red king crab savings area, and that is completely closed to bottom trawl fishing, and is designed to protect adult king crab and their habitats. There's also a nearshore Bristol Bay closure shown in turquoise there, which is intended to protect juvenile red king crab and their habitats, so no trawling can occur there, with the exception of this little red piece here, which is there to allow a small fishery for yellowfin sole. These yellowfin soles follow the herring into spawn, and so there's an opportunity for those yellowfin soles to be harvested with minimum impact, presumably, on the juvenile crab. There's other trawl closures, such as around the Pribilof Islands. It kind of looks like home plate and often referred to as that. It's largely to ban trawling in areas important to blue king crab, hair crab, juvenile habitat, halibut, and their habitats. And then for tanner crab and snow crab, you can see these crosshatch areas that also have prohibited species catch caps, and when hit would close all bottom trawl fishing in those areas. Now, to take actions like this and make changes in how the groundfish fisheries are managed required significant analysis. And I mentioned earlier the National Environmental Protection Policy Act. And so there was an environmental assessment that looked at the effects of bottom trawling on target species, non-target species, and their habitats, as well as alternative policy choices on host of species all the way up to marine mammals and endangered and threatened species of birds and other things. There was a regulatory impact review that took a socioeconomic impact analysis, looking at trade-offs between benefits and costs, and then a regulatory flexibility analysis to consider impacts on small entities. So a lot of EBFM type of analyses had to be undergone and voted on by the council to implement those prohibited species caps and trawl closure areas. Another feature which has been very important in our region is the Ecosystem Status Report, which is produced every year. And it includes dozens of indicators. These reports have gotten hundreds of pages long. Again, they're updated annually as the time series are growing. The goal here was to provide stronger links between ecosystem research and fishery management, and also develop new understandings of the connections among components by synthesizing the results of diverse research, monitoring, and modeling. So there is some synthesis going on. And I wanted to point out that these ecosystem status reports are produced at the large marine ecosystem scale. So there's one for the Eastern Bering Sea, one for the Aleutians, one for the Gulf. The report contains a number of features, beginning with report cards. So this would summarize the time trends of the top, say, 10 indicators for the ecosystem for this year, and an executive summary, which is short summary of the rest of the document to increase utility for public and managers so they could kind of get the gist of changes in the system with a minimum amount of reading. And then it also includes ecosystem assessment and ecosystem status and a host of management indicators, and I'll give some examples. So this is from actually the 2019 ecosystem status report for the Eastern Bering Sea. I've just as example provided two indicators. One is sea ice extent and one is habitat impacted by trawls. Sea ice extent is particularly important for a number of reasons, but snow crab being among them, which are Arctic species. So you basically have time series of these indicators. And then for the last 5 years of the assessment shown in green, there's some emphasis there to look at whether that mean is above or below one standard deviation of the long-term mean, and it's below, so that gives it a minus sign here. And then what the trend is over the last 5 years. Is it positive, no change, or negative? And we could see that sea ice extent has continued to decline. So this kind of highlights the features of these indices and changes that might be of concern that might need some addressing. Parallel to the ecosystem status reports are economic status reports, or sometimes called economic safe reports. They have their own report cards and status and trends. And quite remarkable with respect to the Crab Rationalization Program is for these stakeholders to benefit by being members of that program. A lot of people lost boats and fishing opportunities, but to be participating in that program, they are required to provide cost data, which is like the holy grail for fishery economists. So this wonderful cost data that really allow for semi-regular evaluations of the economic and social impacts of this crab rationalization program. And here's just a few examples of indices from the economic status report. The left-hand side shows the full time series, and the dashed vertical bar line represents 2006 when the crab rationalization program went into place. So we see, for example, this first index is the active number of crab vessels really dropped off after the rationalization program. And then on the right is the time series of the index post-rationalization. So you can just see under even terms of, okay, we're in the rationalization regime now, what are the changes? And it goes on to give other indices that are economic or social. So moving away from those ecosystem and economic status reports, a new feature is what's called ecosystem and socioeconomic profiles. And whereas the ESR was at the large marine ecosystem level, the ecosystem and socioeconomic profiles are at the stock level. And so, for example, in the Eastern Bering Sea, we have Bristol Bay red king crab, we have Pribilof Islands red king crab, we have Norton Sound red king crab, all part of the Eastern Bering Sea. They would each get individual ecosystem and socioeconomic profiles because their environments are very different. So anyhow, these are done as needed. They're not done every year. They're not done for every stock, but it's particularly focused on species of interest. And for example, snow crab rose to the level of interest in recent years. So the ecosystem and socioeconomic profiles is a standard framework for compiling and evaluating relevant ecosystem and socioeconomic indicators and communicating those linkages within the stock assessment process. And importantly, what's intended here is that these serve as, if you will, an on-ramp to actually put ecosystem linkages in the stock assessments themselves. It's something that we're striving toward. We've done just a little bit, but hopefully there'll be more of this in the future. This cartoon shows this illustrates this a little bit further. So this is the ecosystem-based fishery management at the large marine ecosystem level. We have information going into those risk tables as part of stock assessment. Likewise, the ecosystem and socioeconomic profiles. And they would both factor into the harvest specification process. On the right are kind of standalone research activities on ocean acidification, other areas of research that hopefully would eventually lead to indicators that could be brought in through this ESP or ESR process. The procedure for developing ecosystem and socioeconomic profiles is a four-step process illustrated here. Step one is to identify the priority stocks. So these would be maybe the most valuable ones or those that have undergone stress. Step two is identify mechanistic linkages. That includes a literature review, evaluating lab studies that found connections between temperature and molting or whatever the process is that you're looking at. Kind of come up with a short list of mechanisms. And then step three would be to actually analyze those mechanisms, conduct statistical analyses on time series, and see if they do help explain recruitment or do help to explain mortality. And then the last step then is to actually implement those and include them in annual reports. I'd like to zoom in a little bit here on snow crab. So here's a little conceptual diagram of the four main broad processes that are thought to affect the snow crab in the Eastern Bering Sea, from predation, where Pacific cod is they're probably #1 predator among the commercially harvested ground fish. Environmental processes, that is a big emphasis here on sea ice extent and a cold pool, a pool of very cold water on the sea floor. Again, these snow crab is an Arctic species and they depend on those conditions. Competition, these crabs share many food habits with a lot of the flatfishes, the smallmouth flatfishes like rock sole, yellowfin sole, and then the availability of prey, which has come into question in recent years. Here's a little conceptual diagram focusing in on some of the perceived issues of concern in the ecosystem, beginning with the pelagic larval stages. The synchrony of the hatch of larvae with spring bloom is thought to be potentially an important process, and not only the spring bloom in general, but more broadly and more specifically about the sea ice edge bloom that has nutrient-rich phytoplankton and then zooplankton, as opposed to an open sea bloom that might occur when there's not much sea ice in the system. And offshore advection, a loss of larvae out of the system. There's been some regional oceanographic modeling done that found that, at least in simulation, a lot of the larvae produced annually are advected offshore or north and out of the system. Another perceived important part of the life history of snow crab is the early benthic stage and the importance for them to settle in a cold pool under extensive sea ice. It actually forms a refuge and a barrier against Pacific cod. So this can be really critical in mediating cod predation. And then finally, the benthic stages for the adults, benthic production, food production, and then the temperatures regulating their metabolic processes. So this is kind of a short version of some of the key factors that folks have zoomed in for snow crab. And then going towards beginning the first pass through evaluating potential metrics. This is these are baseline metrics for snow crab as percentile rank. The black and gray bars indicate the 80th and 90th percentiles of the rank for these indices across all assessed groundfish and crab stocks. The color shows data quality, so bright green means no data, and solid purple means excellent data. So basically, we're looking at those indices that indicate more vulnerability, and those would be at the bottom of this graph. There's also, at early stages of development, a traffic light indicator analysis where red is bad, blue is good, and white is neutral. And just for example here, looking at the physical road number 2, this is the cold pool, low extent of cold pool indicated by red, and that would be bad for snow crab. And if we go down a couple more rows, the chlorophyll A, we see neutral, but also 2 years of blue, which was good chlorophyll, and which would be good for snow crab. So anyhow, this is a way of kind of rapidly looking at some of these potential indicators. Okay, then the next to last step is an intermediate stage that uses importance methods such as Bayesian adaptive sampling related to the variable of interest, which is often recruitment, which drives the booms in these crab fisheries. And this provides direction, magnitude, uncertainty, and inclusion probability. So the left side, panel A here, are the estimated effect with 95% error bars. So we're looking for the effects that do not overlap with the 0 line. And those include the Pacific cod biomass, cold pool extent, and benthic invertebrate prey biomass. And the right side indicates the marginal inclusion probabilities, and we could see those 3 stand out. So those might be areas to focus on for indicator development. And then the final ultimate analysis is envisioned to be ecosystem link models. And this would be to try to test the role of these indicators more broadly. And while these models have not yet been developed, but there's been some progress made. For example, Cody Zawalski and colleagues examined global climate models and their ability to predict stock distribution and productivity based on historical statistical relationships that they uncovered for the main stocks of red king crab, tanner crab, and snow crab. And then also Cody, in a separate analysis, generated general additive models, GAMs, to evaluate mechanisms for increased mortality of snow crab during 2018 to 2021, and I'll talk about that soon. So a little bit of summary and outlook here. The Bering Sea Aleutian Islands crab fishery management incorporates many EBFM principles, and I'd argue a remarkable number of them. I go into these in much greater detail in the published paper, and I compare them to accepted principles by the Food and Agriculture Organization and another entity. And there's some other actions like gear modifications to reduce impacts on habitats and other species that I didn't discuss. Despite all this extra work and extra information included in crab fishery management, we still are in a situation with very variable crab stocks. In fact, 3 of the crab stocks are currently classified as overfished. Now, overfished is a reflection of being at a depressed state, less than 1/2 of the estimated BMSY. But it actually doesn't, despite the name, doesn't ascribe cause. So they're depleted is probably a better word, and more people are recognizing that environment is probably playing an important role here, less so fishing. And certainly a number of the features still remain single species approaches, like the stock assessments are still primarily using snow crab data to determine the biomass of snow crab and how many could be harvested. We have an on-ramp to bring on environmental factors into that process, and we're working to do that, but still in practice, it's largely single species. So the ecosystem status reports and the ESPs do provide opportunities to bring those indicators in. And I think we'll be seeing more and more of this as time goes on. And I guess a big question is, to bring an indicator into the assessment process, you need a mechanism, you need a cause and effect, and it needs to hold up over time. And that can well be challenged by things like regime shifts and community reorganizations. Some of you may be aware in the late 1970s, the Gulf of Alaska particularly switched from cool to warm set of regimes, and the system switched from one dominated by shrimp and capelin and crab and other cold water species to one dominated by groundfish and salmon and other warm related species. So, the key is, will relationships hold up through events like that? And then never mind, climate change, which is leading to conditions that are well beyond the range that you have to extrapolate out of your data set to really provide some forecast. And the question is, will that hold up over time? So on that, I want to close with a brief information about the case of the snow crab, which collapsed in 2018 to 2021. This is a graph showing male abundance. And I think you could see here in 2018, we had the highest biomass, or abundance, I should say, of male crab ever recorded in the history of the survey. And then with over just 3 years, we went to the lowest biomass of large male crabs ever observed. This graph shows the size compositions over time. So basically at the bottom, you have small crab to the left, large crab to the right, and the years going from 1980 all the way up to 2021. And you can see when young crab are recruited, they survive, they enter the population, they grow, and they get less abundant as mortality takes effect. And that's a typical routine. But if we look up here, in 2015, it was the highest pseudocohort. Pseudocohort is a group of crabs of similar size, not necessarily the same age. We can't age these crab. And in 2015, we had the largest pseudocohort of that size group ever observed, but it declined from 2018 to 2019 by half. 2020, there was no survey owing to COVID. And in 2021, it's essentially a flat line. This big group of crabs that should have extended further into time and with size did not. So in 2021, we found the fewest snow crabs since the survey began in 1975. Cody estimated that more than 10 billion crab were unaccounted for and likely died. And that 10 billion crab is more than 4 times the grand total number of crabs caught in that fishery over the entire history of the fishery. So something major happened. This graph shows the footprint, if you will, of snow crab in 2018. So the colors represent crab density, with the warmer colors, the reds, indicating the highest density. And unlike in typical years where the distribution is much further south, they had a very, very small footprint. So they're very abundant. This is before they died, and they're all compacted into a narrow place to the north. And if we look at some of the indicators, particularly the cold pool in the bright blue and the sea ice extent in the darker blue, turned to 2018, 2019, we have the lowest sea ice extent and the lowest cold pool observed in the record. And then finally, based on some laboratory work, Cody extrapolated the caloric demands based on temperature, abundance at size, and weight at size. And you can see these different colors represent size from small crab to large crab. And he argued that the spike in caloric demands, coupled to the super high abundance, all packed into a small area for foraging, suggests that starvation may have played an important role in the collapse of this stock. He also did, as I mentioned earlier, some general additive modeling work and was able to explain about 3/4 of the mortality of immature crab on the top and mature crab on the bottom. And that mortality was largely associated with 2 factors. So this dashed line is a statistical significance, and to the left of that we have mainly yellow and gray in both immature and mature crab, and that corresponds to temperature and the mature crab population. So it seems that mortality was driven higher by the combination of highly abundant mature crab and very warm temperatures. And all the other factors that he looked at, predation, bycatch, cannibalism, did not come close to statistical significance. So anyhow, that's very interesting, and certainly there's a lot of work going on, some of which is next door. And we'll look forward to hearing all about that in the future, if not tomorrow. So anyhow, I posed this question. So if we saw this happening with the snow crab, again, dropping by half, what would our reaction be? What would be an ecosystem-based fishery management approach? Would we decide we should just catch them before they die? Is they put them in the bank? Is that what the approach should be? Or should we do some dramatic reductions in harvest rates in attempts to maintain some key spawning biomass? And I just reflect here, on this 1970s regime shift and losing many crab stocks in the Gulf of Alaska, and seemingly associated with ecosystem level changes. But some of those stocks, and many of them actually, also experienced high fishing mortality just before they collapsed. So I don't think fishing can be exonerated in this case. And a lot of those harvest rates were much, much higher than we allow today. So, and now 40 years later, the Kodiak red king crab fishery remains closed with little sign of improvement. So it's definitely cause for pause. So I highlight here a few papers, the first, top one being this, basically a companion to this talk that I just delivered to you. And the middle one is the science paper by Cody Zawalski, as well as the third one is a perspective paper in science that I was asked to provide. I give you my email. If you're interested, I could be happy to send any and all of those to you. And with that, I'll pause for any questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to jump into questions, and we're going to start with questions online. Roseanne, any questions yet? All right, for folks online, feel free to put in your questions into the chat box. For folks in the room, are there any questions in the room? All right, give me a sec.
Hi, thanks for your talk. That was great. I was just wondering with your recent visit to Newfoundland, did you get any pearls of wisdom in terms of what they're experiencing there with a reduction in the size of mature males? Was that observed in the Bering Sea prior to the collapse, or?
A great question. And I'm not going to be able to give a perfect answer, but we are experiencing in the Bering Sea changes in size and maturity, and it may well be affected by rates of removal. I think one thing we gained from for the broader audience, we had a snow crab workshop in Newfoundland back in the end of April, early May of last year. And soon I'll get the report out with help from my colleagues. But yeah, several things came out of that. One was change in size and maturity and the importance of large size of males for their population dynamics. In Newfoundland, they had the experience of implementing a precautionary management approach that considered a number of factors and effectively reduced harvest rates, resulting in an increase in the size and maturity and a recovery of the fisheries. So there does definitely seem to be some connections there with size and maturity, harvest rate, and resilience of the stock. And some of this we'll get into because this was topics of discussion at our workshop, so that will come out shortly. But yeah, I expect that managers and crab scientists in Alaska will definitely be taking a close look at that to see if, you know, what it might implicate in our harvest strategy here. But it would certainly not be so amenable to catch them before they die. That might actually, you know, backfire and provide, yeah, for greater reductions in size and maturity. So thank you for your question. I'll give a better answer once the report is ready.
All right, looks like we have a question online. Go ahead, Roseanne.
Is there a ballpark figure for percent of exploitation? 10% of all legal males, 40%, 75%?
Great question. Thank you for that. The harvest rate for crabs is a function of mature male biomass. And so as biomass goes down, the harvest rate goes down. And if it goes down too low, it crosses a threshold and no directed fishing would be allowed. As stocks get higher, the harvest rate increases. The rates depend on which stock we're talking about. You know, I think often a harvest rate is in the range of 20% for king crab, 15%, 20% for king crab, depending on the level of mature male biomass. For snow crab, we've had higher rates of fishing mortality. This is actually going hand in hand with looking at size and maturity and other considerations, is to do an analysis, what we call a management strategy analysis, to look at harvest rate and even size and legal size. And I expect we'll see some research and some proposals to the Alaska Board of Fisheries to make some changes in harvest rates going forward. So I hope that answers your question and gives you an idea that it depends is the answer. Depends on mature male biomass and also which stock we're talking about. But you know, historically, we harvested at much higher rates in Kodiak, for example, which was a model throughout the Gulf. Back in the 60s and 70s, we harvested at, I think, 60% rate. And you know, we just found that that wasn't sustainable. So thank you again for your question.
All right, other questions in the room? Rick.
Thanks for the interesting talk, Gordon. I was curious, one of the effects of climate change is that animals move poleward or into deeper water. And I'm wondering if you've seen if there's any indications that there's any increases sort of in the like in the donut hole area or up in rush waters. When you look at your map of the red king crab, it seemed like they were kind of pushed up to the northern part of the survey area there. Could that be, I know it probably couldn't account for the entire collapse, but has there been any surveys in those areas that would indicate a movement?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. Yeah, I think it was the snow crab that we're referring to that definitely moved further north with warming, and particularly advanced rapidly with the marine heat wave that we had in 2018, 2019. At the same time, there are surveys that National Marine Fisheries Service conducts in the northern Bering Sea. I think they're on an every year schedule at this point. There were some slight increases in snow crab in the northern Bering Sea, but they were nowhere near the numbers that were, or the size that were necessary. Basically, as you move to the northern Bering Sea and Chukchi and Beaufort Sea, there are snow crab there, but they're tiny, and they're well below size of, at least size limits for crab in the eastern Bering Sea. Not a lot of work has gone on over the slope and into Russian waters. I believe that there are plans for a slope survey by National Marine Fisheries Service this year, but we've been without one for a number of years just because of budget situation. So that means it remains a question to be answered. But the slope, Cody Zawalski estimated that the slope surface would constitute just 10% of that total habitat of snow crab. So he argued that that's just too small for them to all have gone there. Another feature is that there is a Russian snow crab fishery on the other side of the line, and that's been ongoing. But they actually saw a drop in catch per unit effort during this heat wave and decline in snow crab. So again, it wouldn't seem that could explain. And then finally, I'm on a master's committee of a student who placed some tags on snow crab in the northern regions of the Bering Sea. And one animal was recorded to have moved into Russian waters. Now that was kind of preliminary, and I know some adjustments in the reanalysis of the movement data needed to occur. So I'm not sure if even that still is the case, but it was 1 out of 20, I think. So yeah, people have looked at it, but hopefully we'll have a slope survey this year that could validate, that no, they're not here, or oh my gosh, it's the mother lode. To be determined, but certainly the northern Bering Sea can explain it, and it seems that mortality is a more consistent explanation. And Cody argued that crabs were in poor condition based on body weight as a function of body size, but crab in the laboratory that you starve, at least some experiments have found they don't change weight. And also weight at size is going to be a function of molt history. So we're really looking forward to work that Louise is doing and her colleagues to examine, hepatopancreas and other indicators of condition. So yeah, I guess I also wonder if we were to catch them all before they die, what condition would they be in? Would they be of high quality for markets, or would they have another negative effect downstream? So good question.
Other questions in the room? Okay, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
I was curious with the king crab fisheries after the marine heat waves, did you see any changes that were similar to the snow crab fishery in terms of temperature related declines?
Very good question. The short answer is not really. There was thinking that we might see the same response in tanner crab because tanner crab and snow crab are so closely related they can mate with each other and produce offspring. But tanner crab actually improved during this period when the snow crab collapsed. Red king crab tend to be more distributed to the southeast in Bristol Bay. They don't overlap so much with snow crab distribution. Although there is a small population around Pribilof Islands that do. There was some slight improvement in red king crab condition during this time. So no, we really haven't seen similar for any other crab stock. I would say though that we have seen some apparent mass mortalities before. One with St. Matthew blue king crab, I think it was 89-90. The abundance just dropped dramatically, and we hadn't seen that before or after. And mortality, natural mortality would seem to be the effect. We looked for fishing and trawling, and there was just no data on any other explanation. And then I mentioned in 1980 to 83, there was a huge decline in Bristol Bay red king crab, and a lot of debate about it, but most people looking at it were unable to find a fishing effect and felt that it was some environmental factor, but unfortunately, we don't have the wonderful indicators that we now have to look at. There is some growing concern that red king crab or may soon be or already are being affected by acidification, lower pH. Colleagues at the lab, NOAA, National Marine Fisheries Service in Kodiak, have done lots of pH studies, ocean acidification studies on the various snow, tanner, and red king crab. The effect depends largely on which species and which life stage, but among them all, it appears that red king crab juveniles are particularly vulnerable and may be being affected. So this is an area of ongoing interest. There was a paper that just came out led by Mike Litso that gets into this in more detail. So it's not conclusive, it's correlative, but it keeps it on the table as a potential factor. So yeah, really this mass die-off of snow crab, it seems to be unique to that species as far as we're aware.
All right, I think we've hit our time, but Gordon has put his email up on the screen, so if folks have additional questions, you can reach out directly to Gordon. For everybody in the room, thanks for being here. I hope to see you at our Science on Tap on the 12th and the 13th for our next seminar. But let's give one more round of applause for Gordon.
Thank you. Appreciate it. It was fun.
Thanks
for
everyone.
coming. Excellent. Thank you so much. You're a good MC.
I'm gonna look at one of the slides if I can.
Please do. I'd be happy to leave it here if you want to. Yeah.